Again, good morning. Good to be with you on this Lord's Day morning. And as we begin this morning, let me invite you, if you would be so inclined, to turn to 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon. What a fascinating character study of a Bible personality. At least for me, among the interesting and intriguing features of his narrative as presented to us in the Bible is his relationship to wisdom. Wisdom. And that's why I ask us to start here in 1 Kings chapter 3, because you might recall, shortly upon his successing his father, King David, to the throne over the United Kingdom, God's covenant people of the Old Testament, God appears to him and asks him to request of God anything that he would choose. And you might remember what Solomon sought. And so there he says, verse 7 of chapter 3, "And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. I know not how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people?" And the speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked this thing. So much so that go down and we'll pick it up, I believe, at verse 12. Here's God speaking, "Behold, I have done according to thy words. Lo, I have given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee." Friends, this early account in Solomon's role as king over God's covenant people demonstrates something. It demonstrates, first of all, his humble spirit. But notice what that humble spirit valued and esteemed above anything else. Wisdom. Wisdom. We find in this young man, this young regal, he esteemed wisdom more than anything else that he could have asked for. Now, I'm sure you remember, Solomon immediately began to manifest that. He began to showcase this extraordinary wisdom that God had bestowed upon him in many ways and to many people. You might remember the scenario right after that, where two women come to him and they're asking, for King Solomon to discern, whose child is this rightly? And you might remember his answer to that. It just amazed the people. But maybe the best glimpse of this is over in chapter 4. Over in chapter 4, look with me beginning in verse 29. "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore." Think about that. "And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Calcol, and Dardel, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all nations round about. He spake 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005. He spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts, and of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom." That's where we begin. Solomon's relationship to wisdom. He values it, he esteems it higher than any other thing that he believes God could have gifted him with. Secondly, I invite you to the book of Proverbs. Because now we find Solomon urging others to value and esteem wisdom more than anything else. Here is that man that has been given this extraordinary measure of divine wisdom, and here he is, and he says to his children, no doubt to the citizens of the nation over which he ruled, and thankfully preserved for us for all future generations, he says, you know what is your greatest possible asset in this life? It's wisdom. Seek wisdom. He will say, seek to obtain wisdom and spare no expense. It is to be valued. It is to be esteemed above everything else. I mean, when you open up the book of Proverbs, look at how it begins. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discernment. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsel. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. I mean, it doesn't take, quote, a Solomon to figure out what this book is all about, right? Here Solomon says, these proverbs are to get you to appreciate, value, and esteem wisdom. Wisdom. So, look at chapter 4. Chapter 4. You can again almost picture Solomon maybe in his palace, in his royal home somewhere. Hear ye children, verse 1, the instruction of your father, attend to know all understanding. But notice when he gets down to verse 5. Get wisdom. Think about a devotional with your kids. And here's how you start. Get wisdom. I was, maybe I shouldn't share this, but I was leaving the cemetery yesterday at Ron Jones's. And I didn't know these people. I believe they might have been relatives of Ron from another state. But anyways, we're leaving, and I'm guessing it's a father talking to his children. He says, beautiful people make big money. I mean, trying to figure out where this came from. He says, and here you had an opportunity to get all gilded up and all beautified and look what you look like. He says, don't you understand? Good looks is the best thing you could ask for in life. And I'm like, wow. We just left a grave. And you come away reproving your children for what they wear? Trying to impress upon them that the best thing you can do in life, the most hope you have for a successful life, dress well. But then we come to Solomon's house. Solomon sits down with his children and he says, get wisdom. Get wisdom. Read on, get understanding. Forget it not, neither decline from the words of my mouth. Forsake her not. She shall preserve thee. Love her. Who's that? Wisdom. Love her, and she shall keep thee. Listen to this. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. With all of your getting, get understanding. Exalt her. She shall promote thee. She shall bring thee to honor when thou dost embrace her. So, second stage, second consideration in this relationship between Solomon and wisdom. First, Solomon values and esteems wisdom so much so that God says, ask me of anything, that's what I need, God. Now we see Solomon, sometime in his life, sitting down with his children, announcing to the citizens of Israel, if you need to know what is the principal thing in life, what you really need, what you should spare no expense in getting, it's wisdom. But then here's the one that's a bit perplexing to me. Because later we are going to witness Solomon, that same man, endowed with exceptional wisdom given to him by God, who would be found pleading with others to embrace it. And we find Solomon making decisions in his life that are so contrary to that wisdom, which he had so valued, which he had so esteemed. And now we discover him dismissing it, even ignoring it. So I take you to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. Verse 1, but King Solomon loved many strange women. We didn't take the time to develop this, but if you go back through the book of through the book of Proverbs, just listen to how many times Solomon says to his sons, to his children, beware of strange women. Don't allow them to be your downfall. And here is Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, you shall not go into them. Neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Verse 9. The Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Friends, I mentioned this curious relationship between Solomon and wisdom because our current series is derived from and really centered in another Bible book that was reportedly penned by Solomon under inspiration. A book that is designed to encourage us, like Solomon, to value and esteem divine wisdom as the thing that is most important. That's what we're trying to do in this series of sermons. We're urging each of us to spare no effort, no cost, view no sacrifice too great to get wisdom. Divine wisdom, true wisdom, just as did Solomon. But here's where we have to make a break with Solomon. Our series is urging and promoting us to constantly, consistently, in a lifelong application of that wisdom in the practical areas of our lives, lest we, like Solomon, invite misery into our lives. Now, please understand, I'm not here to judge Solomon. Some believe Solomon wrote the Song of Solomon in his early life, Proverbs in the middle of his life, and Ecclesiastes at the end of his life. Some would like to think that Ecclesiastes is, if you will, Solomon's repentance. I hope that's right. To my knowledge, God doesn't make that pronouncement for us, nor does he need to. God is a sovereign judge who will judge rightly. That's not for us to decide. But it certainly is noteworthy, right? This man who values and esteems wisdom would then make such foolish decisions, whereby inviting misery into his life. So, that's where we get this series from. Turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. That's where we've been. And again, what we're trying to do here is take Solomon's counsel. He's advancing true wisdom. Take, again, no expense too great to get true wisdom. And it would appear to me, I could be wrong, but it would appear to me that what he's saying here in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 is, verse 5, a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. Embrace true wisdom. And embrace it especially about these matters of time, judgment, purpose. Because in doing that, you can prevent misery. And then I think when you study the book or this chapter of Ecclesiastes, chapter 8, you can see some practical applications of that. And that's what we've been trying to kind of highlight in this series. The first one was accepting authority. I mean, true wisdom says accept God's sovereign authority. And then because of that, accept the delegated authority that He has given in ordaining other authority, such as governmental authority, again, authority in the home, civil authority, government in the church, authority in the church. God wants us in this life to learn submission. That begins with understanding His right to rule our lives. I don't think we've read these verses, but just to kind of summarize that point, drop down to verse, I think it's verse 12. Look there quickly. Solomon says, though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before Him. What does that reverential fear result in? Accepting God's authority. Remember in his conclusion to what life is all about? Fear God. This is the whole duty of man. And so here is Solomon saying, it doesn't matter if there is a person who lives for 100 years, 1,000 years, doing wickedly. It is not well with him. It is well with the individual who fears God. And that's what he goes on to conclude there in verse 13. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. You see, he failed to take this first point under consideration, accepting authority. He lived in rebellion against God. And Solomon says it's not going to be well with him. He's going to invite misery into his life, and then eternally, he's going to experience eternal misery. But it will be well with those who accept misery. That's wisdom. That's choosing wisdom. So the last time we were together, we moved that to a second consideration, and that is true wisdom. True wisdom counsels us to expect that there's going to be an end to this life. And we saw this in verses 7 and 8. Not only accepting that there is going to be an end, but true wisdom also tells us you don't know when it's going to be. And it might be a lot sooner than you anticipate. So not only expect that it's coming, appreciate that you don't know when it's coming. And then the third consideration, the third counsel of wisdom with regards to expecting an end is to understand that there is a divine appointment, death, but there's a second one coming after that. That's judgment. Judgment. So you need to prepare for death. Not only expect that it's coming, you need to be recognizing that this time here on the earth is a proving period. This is a testing time. Here is God finding out what's in your heart. Will you accept His purpose for your life, or will you pursue your own? You know, when you have that scenario, you ought to expect there's going to come a judgment day. There's going to come a day when God, who administered the test, is going to say, let's see how you did. So prepare. True wisdom says, expect an end. Don't know when it's coming, so be prepared for it all times, and be prepared knowing that when you die, you will then stand before God in judgment. So I wanted to spend, and I'm going to do this quickly because I spent my time on the introduction, but I do want us to very quickly just appreciate if we fail to follow heaven's counsel, this true wisdom's counsel, to expect an end, recognize that we don't know when it's coming, and be prepared for judgment to come at the end of this life, well, we fail to do that, we are inviting tragic misery into our lives. You know, man has called death, quote, the king of terror. You ever heard that, Ricky? I read that somewhere. Death is the king of terror. You know, a lot of things might scare people, but death? The thought of dying? It's interesting, I think, that the Bible is very candid in presenting to us man's view of death. Listen to these words in Hebrews 2 and verse 15. He was talking about what Jesus came to do to deliver us, man, who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. Do we understand that language? See, this is a fear. The fear of death is such a fear. It's so, it's just such that it causes us to feel like we are in bondage to it. Something we can't escape. In addition to that, the Bible speaks of death as an enemy. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 26. The Bible speaks of the sting of death. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 56. Question, have you ever felt that? Ever felt the sting of death? That seems to be a very accurate depiction of what emotionally it can do to us. But just think with me. Here is death being perceived by man as an enemy, but not just any enemy. An enemy that brings a form of fearful bondage over us. Can you understand how that can invite misery into a person's life if they fail to understand in God's wisdom you ought to be expecting an end? And what about when people grow old? You know, young people might not think too often about death, but when you start getting our age, Ricky, well, it just gets closer and closer, doesn't it? And for some people, I'm sure that is a very haunting thought. I think that's part of what the Bible is depicting for us. Now, I can't imagine anyone in their right mental state denying death. I don't think you have people walking around, well, I'm not going to die. You know, I refuse to accept that. However, I'm pretty confident we have people who prefer not to think about it. I don't know if you know anyone like this. I know some people who will not go to funerals. Now, that might be because of an emotional scar of the past or whatever reason, but they just prefer not to go to funerals. Maybe people just don't like to think about it. Maybe they certainly would refuse to talk about it. So even though they can't deny it, they try to live as though it is not a reality. Friends, can you see how such an approach to the reality of death can promote misery in people's lives? Not only with regards to the anticipation of their own death, but what about then when it befalls a loved one? And you weren't expecting it, you weren't preparing for it, you weren't thinking that's a possibility. Because friends, as difficult as it is for us to accept it and sometimes to hear it, we have no guarantee that we're going to see our children grow to adult age. We have no guarantee that we're going to see our grandchildren grow up. We have no guarantee that our beloved spouse is going to accompany us to the end of life. Those are guarantees we do not have because divine wisdom says you ought to be expecting an end and you don't know when it's going to come. And so if we do not adopt wisdom's counsel that death is to be an expected end and can come when least expected, I'm just suggesting it can lead to a degree of misery that truly will rob a person of meaningful life. These emotional challenges can be people's undoing. Let me give you a Bible, maybe at least that might fall into that category in a sense. Do you remember the events leading up to Joseph's being sold into slavery? You might remember his brothers hated him. I mean, that's the terminology of the Bible, Genesis chapter 37. And the reason they hated him is because they could easily see that Joseph was their dad's favorite. And one of the manifestations of that was he had made him a coat of many colors. The other brothers didn't get one. And so here is Jacob, Israel, sending off Joseph. He goes, go check on your brothers. They see him off in the distance. And what are they conferring about? We want to put him to death. Because not only was he their dad's favorite, but then he's having these dreams in which they're bowing down to him. Mom and dad are bowing down to Jacob or to Joseph. And so they see their brother coming and they said, let's see where his dreams end up. Let's kill him. Thankfully, Reuben, the oldest of the brothers, steps in and says, let's not kill him. So he puts him over in a pit. And then sometime while Reuben's not with the other brothers, here come these traders, these merchants along, foreign merchants, and they said, hey, what profit is there if we kill the boy? But if we sell him, we'll get something for him. They took him out of the pit, sold him for 20 pieces of silver. Reuben goes to the pit to find his brother and rescue him, and guess what? He's gone. Now they have to go home with the story. And they go home having taken that coat of many colors, dipped it in goat's blood, and presented it to their dad and said, Father, we found this in the way. Is this the coat you gave to Joseph? Do you remember what it says about Jacob? I want you to listen to this. This is Genesis chapter 37. Verse 33, here are the sons, and he knew it and said, this is Jacob's response. He says, he knew it and said, it is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth upon his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All of his sons and all of his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. Listen to what he says. I will go down to the grave unto my son mourning. His father wept for him. I'm going to suggest, thankfully, he didn't know actually what happened, and this would all change in some years later, but I would suggest Jacob was going to live the rest of his life in misery. The joy of living has just been taken from him because of his mourning, his grieving over his favorite son. I'm just suggesting maybe this is a depiction, a real life depiction of what misery can be brought into a person's life when we just fail to contemplate the possibility of our loved ones being taken from us in death. Now, very quickly, I'm going to close out with this. Do you recall, you can be turning to Luke 12, do you recall Jesus' parable about the rich farmer? I think this is worth our consideration quickly. You remember how God styled that man? Now again, it's a man that Jesus presents in this story, in this parable. But you remember in the parable, in the story, what Jesus says God's assessment of the man was. You remember what he called him? A fool. God's going to call this man, pictured here, a fool. Question. What do you think rendered him a fool in God's assessment? I'd like to submit for our consideration that it is, at least in part, because of the very concepts of which we speak. Remember, we were talking about purpose, time, and judgment. Let's think about purpose. First of all, what precipitated this parable? What precipitated Jesus talking about this parable? Well, if you look there in chapter 12, you might remember somebody came to him from the company, at verse 13, came to him and said, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. Here was Jesus' response to him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? Now listen to the warning that precipitated the telling of the parable. Jesus said to them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consists not in the abundance of things which he possesses. What is Jesus talking about? The purpose of life. Jesus is here issuing a warning about how people have foolishly misunderstood the purpose of life. And this man's question demonstrates that. His greatest concern. He is before God incarnate. And you know what he's worried about? Getting part of an inheritance. And Jesus says, take heed. You are missing, you are misled and deceived about what life is all about. Purpose, right? And then Jesus tells the story. And listen to the story. Spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. He thought within himself. He's having a soliloquy. Here's his soliloquy. He's talking to himself, and he says, the ground, what am I going to do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. Then he said, This is what I'll do. I will pull down my barns. I will build greater, and there I will bestow all my fruits and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have much goods laid up for many years. Time. His counsel to himself is, Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And God says, You fool. You know what he failed to understand? He failed to understand that you ought to be expecting an end to life. And you ought to recognize that you don't know when that end's going to come. And here you are mapping out many years of your life, saying, I've got all of these provisions. Now all I have to do for the remainder of my days is eat, drink, and be merry. And God says you're a fool. Because you failed to wisely recognize. You should have been expecting an end. And you should recognize that you don't know when that end was coming. So here you are making these plans. Purpose, he failed to understand his purpose in life. Time, he failed to appreciate. The time he does have is a gift from God, and he doesn't know how much of it he has. But then what was Jesus' application of this whole parable? It was about judgment. Judgment. You see, foolishly choosing not to use his time on earth to be rich toward God, this rich farmer is going to meet God in judgment that night and be unprepared. He will be ushered into eternal misery. Verse 20, God said to him, You fool. This night your soul will be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which you have provided? Listen to Jesus' application. So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You know who dies as a fool? Anyone who fails to understand God's purpose for life, who fails to take into account he doesn't know how much time he has, but the time he does have here, he ought to be using to be rich toward God, because one day he's going to stand before God. and be judged. Misery. Misery will be invited into our lives if we do not wisely approach life and death, the expected end. That wise approach not only demands that we expect an end, but finds us preparing for that end, so that when we meet God in judgment, God won't say, "You fool." God rather will invite us in, having said, "You understood. You understood your purpose for being here. You understood the time you had should have been used to be rich toward me, and now in judgment, you've proven your wisdom. You'll be accepted." God's counsel to us is, as it relates to death, here's God's wise counsel. Listen to my son. Listen to Jesus. We didn't read those verses over in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 again, but you might remember it says, "What man has power in the day of his death?" Doesn't death cause us to really appreciate our sense of powerlessness? Yesterday, I viewed a beloved brother that I've known for many years lying in a casket. You know what? You want to feel powerless? Right there it is. I can only imagine for his wife and for his son, his grandchildren walk up there. You feel powerless. What can I do? There he is, but it's only his body. What can I do? But in recognizing our own sense of powerlessness in death, aren't you thankful? Aren't you thankful that we've heard the good news that there is one who has power over death? Jesus. And so that's what God's wisdom is. That's what true wisdom counsels us. True wisdom, choosing wisdom to prevent misery in our lives, finds us hearing God who says, "Listen to my son. Humbly submit to him, because he alone has power over spiritual death and physical death." Didn't he demonstrate that at Lazarus' tomb? Here he is announcing, "I am the resurrection and life," and Martha and Mary, they're saying, "Yes, we know he'll raise one day, but if you had been here, Lord, you could have prevented him from dying." And Jesus is there weeping at that tomb, empathizing with loss and death. And then Jesus, God in the flesh, will exercise his power over death. He will say to the Hadean realm, "Open your gates, let Lazarus come out." That spirit left paradise, re-entered that entombed body, and Lazarus got up and walked out of that grave alive. See, Jesus alone has power over death. And so choosing wisdom to prevent misery in our lives is to hear God's wise counsel. Listen to my son. Obey him. Because if you are in him when you die, you don't need to sorrow like others. You die in hope. Because he's overcome death. He's the one who took the sting out of death. He's the one who has changed the enemy, death, into a friend. So that, like Paul, you can say, "I'm in a twixt. I'd rather die. I'd rather die and go to be with Jesus, but I'll stay here if that's what's necessary to labor longer." See, he took a fearful event and made it a favorable event. And then one day, Jesus will show his ultimate power over death, as he exclaimed in John 5, because he says, "The day is coming that my voice will command all that are in the grave to come out. Be joined to their bodies, resurrected." Jesus alone has power over death. God says, choose wisdom. Listen to my son. He's the only one. He's the only one who can take the sting out of that expected end. He's the only one who can remove the fear of bondage that comes with that expected end. He's the only one who can allow us to be victorious, even in that expected end of death. So if you've never put on Jesus in baptism, in gospel obedience, friends, I urge you to do that. Like Solomon of old, I urge you to be wise. Be wise. Listen to Jesus, the personification of wisdom, because He alone has power over death.